In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Very nice to be with you here this week. We have done a mini-series here for, I think, what's the first time ever on Veracity Hill, where we've done the same topic back-to-back weeks, but it's really a continuation. It's not sort of a repeat. Last week we had on the program the question of canon. Michael J. Kruger was our guest, where we went really, in some cases, deep into the issues about canon formation and objection, even the definition of the canon. What does canon mean? What are the different views on that? Very intriguing conversation with him. If you haven't yet listened to that episode, I really want to encourage you to do so. You can do so by listening to the program on iTunes, following our Facebook page. You can go back, find that video. Go to our website. If you subscribe to the website, you'll get emails anytime a new episode's posted. Mark, our communications associate, does that very fine work. But on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the making of the New Testament. So we will be talking, I'm sure, a little bit about canon formation, but also some other issues, such as the origin of the material, the collection of the documents, the text itself, what those things say. So on today's program, I've invited a very special guest. He is a longtime professor of New Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's had been there for 25 years, but now he's professor emeritus, which means you are in good standing with the institution where you've been at. And his name is Arthur Patzia. He's the author of The Making of the New Testament, Origin, Collection, Text, and Canon. He's our guest on today's program. Art, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
I do want to apologize to you and to our regular listeners for our delayed start here. We had some unforeseen technical difficulties on both Chris's side of things and my side of things. Some of my audio clips were removed. I've done some changing here, but thank you for your patience, Art, and to our viewer who they are folks that know that roughly around 1 p.m. we get started with our program. Sometimes it's 1:05 or whatnot. But very excited to have you on the program, Art. When we think about the making of the New Testament, when it was written, how it was written, the documents, it seems that one of the first questions we need to ask ourselves is, what was the literary world like in the first century? Could you tell us a little bit about that cultural milieu, the relevant documents, and just what life was like there?
Well, I wish we knew more, but we don't, and have to depend on some of the literature that is available at the time and some of the history of the communities. The literary world of the New Testament goes back to the ancient Near East, where you have Mesopotamia, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Canaan, some of those ancient civilizations. In the Greco-Roman world, you have the time of Homer, of Hesiod, of Plato, Aristotle, and we know some of that from our undergraduate work in philosophy and literature. There were a lot of ancient libraries at the time. Nineveh, Babylon, Athens, Alexandria, Pergamon had great libraries which partially were destroyed and partially were retained. And then in the New Testament, you have examples of writings from Ephesus, Rome, Caesarea. You have the Qumran material from the caves outside of Jerusalem. The Nag Hammadi texts, and then, of course, other houses where the bigger houses at least had libraries. So the literary world of the New Testament is certainly there, and is something that the writers of the New Testament had to be aware of and to take account of.
These libraries you refer to, these ancient libraries, these have been the sources for many of our ancient works. Not just for the New Testament, but extra biblical documents as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. Yes.
And if we hadn't discovered these libraries, so if the work of archaeologists haven't done that, just for a ballpark idea, I mean, how much of the ancient material would we have without those libraries?
It's hard to say because there are some documents that were completely destroyed. There are references to certain authors, but none of the material has been retained. And others, of course, are better off and more reliable and dependable for the authors that looked at them.
What would be some examples of authors who are mentioned in what we would consider secondary sources, but whose primary works haven't survived to this day?
I'm drawing a blank on that. I think of a few names, but I can't remember exactly who they were or how much of their material was retained.
Yes, well, that's
so
right.
I apologize for that.
And certainly there are folks, we do have some of their material, but some of their materials also don't exist. In my doctoral work, there are folks where it's a similar situation where they wrote they said they wrote something. You see that something was written, but and a church father may even quote from it, but we just don't have the primary source to compare it, which is, of course, unfortunate. So, for example, I studied monks from the 5th century, and there are the Vincent of Lorraine. There are these objections that he wrote, but we don't have them. So, yeah, it's certainly one of the problems. But nevertheless, there are a treasure trove of documents from that literary period, and they can serve to help us better understand the context in which the Gospels were written. So when thinking about the making of the Gospels and other New Testament literature, in the subtitle of your book here on the origins, what are some important questions that we need to ask when we're thinking about the origin of the documents?
Well, I take a pretty standard approach to how the Gospels came to be written and deal with the various criticisms that have arisen. Criticism in the sense of judgment, rather not negative,
right?
Necessarily, but the form criticism, source criticism, redaction criticism are kind of the three big ones that loom, and there are, of course, positive aspects to them, and there are some negative things that we need to think of when we look at them as well. And some of the writers or scholars in New Testament studies like James Dunn and N.T. Wright and others have drawn some of the negative implications of falling wholeheartedly along the line of one of these criticisms and not evaluating it for what it is.
For our listeners, could you define and describe those different areas, form criticism, source criticism, etc.?
Well, form criticism goes back to, some of the earlier scholars like Rudolf Bultmann and Martin Debelius, when they looked at the Gospels and they saw that there were certain stories, paradigms, novels, myths, and so forth, and they felt that the teachings of Jesus were organized around these various forms. What happened in the process was, to use James Dunn's criticism, they lost sight of the living and the dynamic character of the tradition. And we're pretty sterile in terms of, well, here's a form, there's a form, and this fits into that category, whereas you lose sight of the fact that the Gospels were living, or the teachings of Jesus at least, were living and dynamic in character. So that's so much for form criticism. Source criticism deals with the use of the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I have in my book diagrams indicating the percentage of material of Mark that was reduplicated and so forth. Redaction criticism is one of the more exciting, and that indicates that each author was a theologian in his own right and produced materials that were important to that individual. And that accounts for what we call the synoptic problem. And that is, well, why are there so many similarities in the synoptics? Synoptics means seeing together. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the three that are in that, and John is kind of separate from that. But it indicates the fact that the redaction is a theologian, independent acting theologians, and they have their own story of Jesus. And often this comes to be talked about the portraits of Jesus. And you have 4 portraits which are different,
yes,
but they talk about the same person.
Yes, and I agree, and I really enjoy that language of a portrait of Jesus. Now, you talk about the synoptic problem, and for our listeners, a lot of folks perhaps don't realize the issue of literary dependency between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And of course, determining what and how that is something that scholars spend their days writing books on. But perhaps that's a detriment to the Christian church for only, teaching on, a few verses here, a few verses there, and people forget the big picture and they don't see how much material is there. So you mentioned you've got a chart here. So on page 73 of the second edition, at least, there's a nice fine chart which describes that. And so for our listeners, in Mark, you have 661 verses that are, that's either, I think that's total, but you can see here that it's something close to 95% of it is common material to Luke and Matthew. So, if Mark were written first, it very well seems like Matthew and Luke have access to Mark and are using a lot of Mark's material. And not that that's a bad thing, like maybe today you'd have plagiarism if you're not quoting or citing your sources properly. But back then that would have been okay, given the standards. So what are some, if I can sort of take us in a little bit of this direction, what are some of the different views on the synoptic problem?
Well, the question that we didn't deal with, or you didn't mention, was Q, which is the German word for Quelle, a source. And so both Matthew and Luke contain material that isn't in Mark. And the question, of course, is from where does that come?
Yeah.
And so that's another source that has to be dealt with, and there are specialized texts on the material in Q and evaluating the approach that the gospel writers use for the Q material. But it is a different type of material that found its way into the gospel tradition, but people really don't know what to do with it.
Yes, there are people that write books and doctoral theses on Q.
That's right.
A work which doesn't survive. Now, some even dispute whether it is a work. Maybe it's an oral source, perhaps. For those that are followers of the Risen Jesus podcast, which I participate in with Dr. Mike Lacona, we've talked about Q, and his theory is something like Q is the gospel that Matthew had written in Aramaic, and it was perhaps the logia, the sayings of Jesus, from which Luke and then Matthew uses his own sort of first draft, if you will. So that was his hypothesis. If I can ask you, Art, maybe what's your view on Q?
Well, that isn't one of them. That sounds too complicated. And my view is that perhaps out there in Palestine there was a group of people that latched onto certain sayings of Jesus, and just the fact is that there is that source. So I don't know if Matthew is particularly susceptible to that, if that's part of the logia, the Aramaic translation. I really don't know, and the technicality of all this has become so human, so large, that the average scholar can't look at all of this and read all the material that comes out. But there are very good sources on the Q material, which I do have in my footnotes.
This is one of the reasons why I picked studying 5th century monks from southern France, because the material was so small. I perceived I could actually read everything that's been written. Whereas for someone that wants to do a doctoral hypothesis or thesis on the topic of the synoptic problem, they probably couldn't spend 5 years reading all of the literature.
That's right. That's true.
There's just been so much.
It's a real specialty.
Yes. Okay, so let me ask you about the genre of the gospel. So this is, you have a section here in your book on the genre of it, and it's becoming and perhaps unbeknownst to you, there are some internet bloggers that have been really debating this subject of the genre. In the 1990s, Richard Burridge published a work arguing, the book was called What Are the Gospels? And he argued that the Gospels belong to the genre of bioi, or biography, really.
Yeah.
And so this theory has kind of taken root in New Testament scholarship, but there are some people, especially very conservative Christians, that don't like that. What's been your understanding of the genre of the Gospels, and have I missed anything in the contemporary debate?
Well, I think you've nailed it in terms of the biographies, and that seems to be a very popular approach. Because for many years, the fact of biographies was not evident, and people said, well, the way to understand the Gospels is through ancient biographies, and so they looked at biographies from the ancient world, from the ancient literary non-Christian world, and saw many similarities, and so Burridge and others have latched onto that. The gospel genre, I'm not sure what to say about that, other than the fact that the biographies are one of them. The other is the development of the kerygma, the good news, the proclamation of the gospel, which is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so there's a lot of emphasis in New Testament studies today on that aspect of the material rather than biographies, which are limited in some ways.
Yeah. Okay, so you're in the 1st century, maybe you're in the 2nd century. Let's say you go to a church, which is probably in someone's home. You've heard about the teachings of Jesus. Maybe there are some documents here, but there are some other documents as well, which claim to be or include the teachings of Jesus. And how does one determine which Gospels are authoritative? Why is there a need for the collection of the apostolic data or sources?
Well, you're dealing with a long period of time, because you don't have the canon finalized until the Council of Carthage in the 4th century. But these other Gospels have created a lot of problems for New Testament scholars. And so when you compare them with the apostolic writers, that we attribute them to, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there is a difference between the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, some of these other Gospels that didn't make the canon. There are scholars today that hold fast to these Gospels. They feel they should be admitted into the canon, but I think the canon is closed, and there won't be any opening of it, although people consider that material. And there are books written on each of those Gospels that I mentioned, Philip and Thomas. Right. But when it came to deciding on the canon, which books belonged authoritatively to the church opted to stick with those that were written by apostles or relatives of the apostles or so on.
Right, yes. Someone who is connected to an apostle.
You're right.
Yep. Now, last week when we had Dr. Kruger on the program, I had asked this question, which you just brought up, about open canon or closed canon. So here's the question I posed to him, and I'll now raise it to you since you kind of brought it up. I'm curious. Let's suppose that some archaeologists are digging in Turkey, and they find an ancient church, and there are some jars that are buried, and they open up one of the jars, and they discover this letter, and it says, translating from my fictional ancient document here, from Paul, an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the church of Laodicea. So let's say we found an authentic, copy here of either copy or goodness, an original of Paul's letter to the church at Laodicea. Should we consider reopening? So maybe the canon's closed for now, but would you be open to reopening the canon question?
Well, that's very hypothetical.
Yes.
Your example, as well as the question. I would say no, because I don't think it'll happen.
Okay.
The church has decided these 27 books belong to the New Testament, and for better or worse, and for other material that may be found, and you mentioned Laodicea, that's a good example.
Yeah.
I don't think the canon will be open, although it will be considered, but I don't think you'll see a PS at the end of the New Testament saying, well, here's another letter that we think should be in, or another gospel that should be in. So from my perspective, I think the canon is closed, and we have to deal with that material that we have. Right.
So God has given us what we've needed, and that's good enough. And so maybe even if something were to be found, we would just consider it maybe like the Didache, where it's still extremely valuable, but wouldn't be scripture. So it's not something
it may be good for filler material, or to reconstruct some of the texts that we have. And the Didache certainly does that. But in terms of including it in the canon, I don't think it'll happen.
Yeah. All right. So let me ask you, what and how did the church fathers think about the Gospels specifically, or the canon in general? I know that's kind of a broad question.
Well, I talk about the stages of collection, going back, I think it's page 91 or so forth, and talk about Papias, Justin Martyr, Tatian, his Diatessaron, which is translated through the 4 Gospels, Irenaeus, the Muratorian canon, and so forth. And they vary, and the whole process of the canon, because it took 4 centuries, you have different writers or fathers, as you mentioned, church fathers, coming to different conclusions about what should be in and what shouldn't be in.
Yeah.
But eventually, the church decided that these were the factors that go into the canonicity, or the process of canon, and all we have is the testimony of these people.
Right. Now, they, for you, while the canon was closed, you still see these church fathers as holding that the 4 Gospels that they mentioned are authoritative. So for them, they were still the markers, but the question was still being debated. Is that fair?
Well, yeah, and there are several reasons for it. One is, the spread of the Gospels, the spread of the church to different areas of the world.
And by that you mean literally that the document would not have reached a certain geographic region yet, right?
That's possible, yes, that's possible. They were slower than the missionaries on foot or on horseback.
Yeah,
or on boat.
And they didn't have the printing press back then.
There were also the different Gospels that were discovered, Thomas and Philip, as I mentioned before.
Yeah.
And then Marcion, who was kind of a denigrated church leader, dismissed. He drew up a list of what he thought were the 4 Gospel collections, and that was disputed, and I doubt whether he was the instrumental cause in leading to the canon.
Yeah.
But you have the existence of the four Gospels by the 2nd century, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the church had to deal with them, and so gradually they came to be collected.
Yeah, very nice. Good. Well, Art, we're going to take a break here, and when we come back from the break, we'll have a segment that we call What's Behind Kurt. We've got an update on that segment, and another segment with you, Art, that we call Rapid Questions, where we ask just some fun questions. But so we've got to take a short break from our sponsors. On today's show, I'm joined by Arthur Patzia. He's the author of The Making of the New Testament. We'll be sure to put a link to this book. It's now in its 2nd edition, and it's truly a wonderful book as I've been working through it. If I were to teach a freshman or sophomore class on the New Testament, this strikes me as a book that every young college student should be reading to become introduced to these issues that scholars have been thinking about. Truly a wonderful book. All right, so when we come back, we'll have some of our fun segments and then get back to our conversation on the making of the New Testament. So stick with us through the short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Lycona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill Podcast with Kurt Jarris, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor, you can go to our website, Veracity Hill, and click on the patron tab there. You can learn more about the sponsorship levels. We'd love to promote your business, your company, your ministry, or a book that maybe you've just recently published. Also, I would like to encourage you, if you're one of our devoted listeners, to become one of our recurring monthly patrons. The patrons are folks that just chip in $5, $10, $20, or more bucks per month to help this program continue to go and grow. We're very thankful and appreciative of our monthly supporters. It's really been a blast to be doing this program now for over 3 years. I view it as a part-time job, producing this program, finding guests, coming up with the content, and even thinking of new fun segments like this one. This is our 5th week, Chris?
I think we're on week 5.
We're on week 5. Okay, and if you're ready, Chris, what is the name of the segment? What's Behind Kurt? Okay, yes. Very nice. All right, so the name of the game here is that this is a green screen. I mean, it's totally green to me. But to our viewer, they see the Veracity Hill signage, or
That's correct.
either the full signage or part signage.
Yeah, they see the logo. The whole
They see the logo. Okay.
Yeah.
But you can really have a lot of fun with this, we realized. So the way it works is someone has submitted something, an image for Chris to put on the background here. And I have to guess what it is. Now, I only have 12 questions.
12, yep.
I'm 0 for 4. And we might have to make it like 15 questions because I've gotten close a couple times.
Yeah.
I'm getting the impression that this is the type of game where I will get it right on like the 50th try.
You may indeed.
Okay. So I guess I'm ready. Thankfully, it's not timed, but we'll try to be quick.
All right.
So if you're ready.
I am ready.
Okay. Is it a person?
Are you? Or you're not checking the comments either, right?
No,
Okay, you've hit it
yep.
all.
No,
Okay.
I can't see anything. No stream, nothing. Okay.
Great. What was your first question?
Is it a person?
Yes.
Is it a fictional person?
No.
Okay. I hate to waste a question on this one, but is it a human?
Yes.
Because you can have, I mean, I think to some definitions, non-human persons. You know, like an angel. Angel's a person, not a human.
Well,
right?
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, you have the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Father's a person, not a
that's
human.
true.
Right. Okay.
I'll keep
Like I
that
said,
in the
I
back of my
hate to
mind.
waste a question
Right.
on it.
One
All
of
right.
these days.
Okay. So we've determined. Sorry, it's a human person, real, right? I
Real,
said,
yeah.
Okay. Is this person alive today?
Yes.
Ooh. Okay, that helps. Is this person? Does this person work in the entertainment industry? So, like an actor or an athlete?
No.
Okay. Is this person a politician?
No.
Some might view that as the entertainment industry.
Hey. There you go. What a zinger.
Okay. Oh boy, I've got to think of my. So, clarifying question: does entertainment industry cover authors?
It can.
Okay.
It can. Depending on the genre of the authorship, I suppose.
All right. So, wow, I might have a really difficult time figuring this out. Not a politician, not in the entertainment industry. So, like, who would be a popular person? Presumably a popular person. All right. This is gonna be kind of funny, maybe. Well, do I know this person personally?
Oh, no.
Okay, so maybe someone was like, "Hey, here's a picture of Kurt's wife," and all right.
I get that.
Let's see. So I don't know this person.
You've used half your question. Over half your questions at 7.
Yeah.
So you're-
Okay.
you're 7 questions.
Wow. Is this person an entrepreneur? It's like a businessman.
No. They might do some of that, but
Okay.
they are not known for it.
Okay, we're already at they. I again hate to waste a question. Is this person a male?
Yes.
Okay.
So you're at 9 questions. You've used 9 questions.
Not an athlete.
Not an athlete.
Not an actor.
No.
Not a politician. Not a businessman.
No.
Not anybody I know.
Not personally.
Is this okay? Is this an apologist?
No.
I should have asked the broader question first. Is this a scholar? A professor?
Yes.
Oh, great.
You have 1 question left.
Oh, my gosh. So this person is a professor.
Yes.
They're alive today.
Yes.
Oh, good grief. See, this is why we need a few more questions.
I think you're right, yeah.
I have just 2
You have one.
One.
You have 1 left.
God, good grief. I didn't even narrow it down to like what country on planet Earth this professor teaches at. All right. Is it a Christian? I'm going to ask a few more questions just for the sake of
Oh,
the-
really? Okay.
Yeah,
How many do you want to go to?
I want a couple more questions.
You
I
want?
mean,
Okay.
let's go to 15.
Let's go to 15. All right.
All right.
We'll officially go to 15. So you have 4 more questions
All right.
total.
Is this professor a Christian?
No.
Does this professor teach in the United States?
No.
Non-Christian, living professor. Okay. How many more questions do I have?
You have 2 questions. 2 questions.
Okay. Does this professor teach at Oxford University?
No.
So it's not Richard Dawkins. boy. Well, all right. I guess I'll give up. I've gone over the 12.
Well, you've got one. You've got one left.
Okay. Well, is it? I have no idea. I give up formally.
You give up formally.
My king just went like this. That's a chess reference.
That's
okay.
Yep. The person behind you is Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Oh. JP.
Wow.
Okay. All right. That was a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, I missed that one. I think I was just asking a few questions out of order the wrong way.
I did put him in a niche that you don't normally normally look in.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well,
all right.
That's the segment we call.
Oh, wow. Here we go.
He's got it.
What's behind Kurt?
What's behind Kurt? All right. If you want to submit an image for this segment of the program, email Chris. That's chris@defendersmedia.com. Send him the image, send him the answer, and maybe a short description as well, specifically an answer you're looking for. So if it's an image of Tim the Toolman Taylor, let Chris know if you're looking for Tim the Toolman Taylor or Tim Allen, the actor. So that's really important. We'd love to get your support of this, what we think is a fun new segment. Okay, moving along now. We want to learn more about our author today, Art Patzia. He's the author of The Making of the New Testament, Origin, Collection, Text, and Canon, published by IVP. Art, this is the second edition that you've put out. Before we get to our segment, Rapid Questions, tell me, what were some materials you included in the second edition that weren't in the first?
Well, it's an expansion of material, and because of the age difference between the two, there were a lot of bibliography updates that I had to do and give, and a reconsideration of some of the theories that had existed.
Oh,
so
sure.
the second edition includes some of that, and it's an expansion of the first. I remember dealing with the editor of InterVarsity on the title, and we had talked about the formation of the New Testament, or just the New Testament, but because it wasn't an introduction or a theological text, that the making, dealing with how the material came about, how it was organized, and how it developed across the country, and the formation of the Pauline materials is especially new.
Yeah.
Some of the material and sections on that. So that dealt with stuff that I didn't deal with in the first edition.
Good. And I'm certainly hoping to talk about Paul and that chapter after Rapid Questions here. So the name of the game is Rapid Questions, Art. We put 60 seconds on the clock, so it's certainly shorter than our last.
I thought you had that segment.
Well, this is that was What's Behind Kurt. So this one we get to hear more about you.
Oh, I see.
And just ask some fun.
You have to deal with an old show that I used to watch as a kid in Canada called 20 Questions.
Yes.
And the panel had to decide within 20 questions who was who.
If I had 20 questions, Chris, my success rate would go up. I think we'll have to talk about even 15. Yeah, so...
go for 20.
Art says 20, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, Art, well, so I'm going to start the game clock here.
Yeah.
When you're ready, I'm going to ask just some fun questions so we can get to know you a little bit better.
Okay.
All right, here we go. What's your favorite sports franchise?
Winnipeg Jets.
Okay, are you left-handed or right-handed?
Right.
Have you ever driven on the other side of the road?
Yes, in England.
Okay, what is your favorite board game or card game?
Trivia Pursuit.
Ah, nice. When you go on a trip, do you pack lightly or are you over-prepared?
Usually over-prepared.
If you could time travel, would you go backwards or forwards?
Forwards.
Who is your favorite superhero?
By that you mean whom?
Superman, Batman, Iron Man.
Oh, I see. I think Batman.
Okay, very nice. What's your favorite season of the year?
Winter.
Okay, what occupation would you never attempt?
Farming.
If you had to pick a fictional character, which one would you meet?
Boy, I don't know on that one. I'd have to think about that.
Yeah. Oh, maybe Batman.
Offhand, I don't know.
Okay, so you mentioned there. Thank you for playing that round of rapid questions. The clock is finished up here. The Winnipeg Jets. So you are from Canada originally, and
Yes.
This is going to be an awful question since I'm fairly up on sports. The Jets, is that the NHL hockey team up there?
Oh, you got to know that.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
All right, good. There aren't too many sports teams, at least that make the news in America from Canada, unless it's hockey. So,
Yeah.
But I know there's Canadian football, American football. You know.
Well, no, it's Canadian. It's different.
Well, the league is different rules, yes, but it's not soccer. So in Europe, you call it, if you call it football, they think you're kicking the ball.
No.
Yeah.
And by the way, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers won the Grey Cup, which is Canada's championship, the equivalent of the U.S. Victory here.
Okay, so now you live in California. So how do you stay up on? Do you read the newspaper? Do you watch the games somehow that happen up there?
I have DirecTV.
Yeah.
And so some of the games are on, and they did have the semifinals and the finals in the football season.
Yeah.
But usually it's the internet. ESPN Plus has some of the material.
Yeah, fun.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, let's jump back to our conversation about the making of the New Testament. And you'd mentioned in the second edition you've added material on Paul here. And we talked about the Gospels in the first half, and maybe we can move to the letters now of Paul. And for those that are unfamiliar with the academic debates, there are some concerns over the authenticity of Paul's letters. Some are granted as authentic, but others, the pastoral epistles specifically, people dispute whether Paul wrote them. But tell me, what are some issues we need to think about when we're reflecting and thinking on the writing of, the literal writing of, the penning of Paul's letters and other issues of canonicity?
Well, the word that you didn't mention is pseudonymity.
Pseudonymity, yes.
Yeah. And these were supposedly letters written by Paul, but written by someone else, incorporating Paul's ideas and so forth. But the content indicates that they are pseudonymous, false letters. I think generally I'm safe in saying that there are 13 letters attributed to Paul. And the way in which they came about, the way in which they traveled throughout the known world, the way they were organized and collected, all deal with things that I talk about in the book.
Yes. Okay. So let me ask you, for some of the disputed letters, someone may attribute it to Paul even within the letter, but that doesn't mean Paul actually wrote it. Would you have a problem if it were, say, an apostle of Paul, or a disciple of Paul, someone who was close to him? Would that still, for you, mean it was of value, and that we know that this was the early teaching of the church and that it's authoritative? Or would you say, would you be a bit more skeptical and say something like, well, this casts doubt on its authenticity, so we can't really trust it as a letter to represent the Christian church?
Well, there are a couple things here. One is the fact that they are in the canon.
Right.
The so-called pseudonymity letters or pseudonymous letters of Paul. I don't have trouble feeling that this is one of Paul's co-workers, Timothy or Titus or whoever. And some of the letters that have been questioned include Ephesians and Colossians as well. So definitely someone writing this letter at a later period of time, after Paul's death perhaps, was using Paul's name. And that was a common feature of pseudonymity and wasn't considered evil or bad. And so I would hold that that there are 13 letters attributed to Paul, and whether or not all of them are Pauline or not, it doesn't matter.
What are the issues surrounding the actual penning of the letter? Did Paul himself write these letters?
No, not all of them he didn't, and nor or parts of them. There's definitely where Paul is the sole author, but also the use of a secretary, the use of co-workers, and then, of course, you have the pseudonymy epic brought into this. So there are other people besides Paul writing and penning some of this. And go ahead.
Was having a secretary a fairly common thing back in the first century?
Yes.
So there shouldn't be any concern if people are wondering, oh, is this really Paul's thought? It was very common for someone to recite what they wanted written down. Well,
you get a difference of opinion on this. The fact that it was common is there's a disagreement there. And the fact that someone else may be using Paul's name is considered by some as anathema and not proper. But
right.
I don't accept that position at all.
Sure. When Paul writes that he's writing in big letters, what does that mean?
It's probably eyesight. He had poor eyesight.
Okay, so in this case, it's not a secretary. It's Paul actually writing himself because maybe his eyesight's beginning to go and he needs to write bigger so he can see what he's writing.
Yeah, it's possible. That's one interpretation anyway.
Yes, and he had these co-workers as well that you'd mentioned, Timothy and Titus, and perhaps they were part of the letter formation of Paul's material. What are some of the earliest manuscripts that we have of Paul's letter? So I know that I've been to the Chester Beatty Library
in London. In London?
Yes, Dublin, I think.
Dublin.
Yes,
okay.
And
Chester Beatty, sure.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about the manuscript evidence, and maybe we can get into talking about manuscript and the material, the parchment, those sorts of things in the writing of the New Testament.
Well, I think there are two different issues. One is the existence of the material. Some of it's partial, some of it is almost complete, and some has been lost or torn away. So you have that. And then when it comes to the actual writing, whether it's Paul or someone writing in his name, you have the distribution of this material into parts of the ancient world. And so the theories of collection, vary. Some think that there's a gradual collection theory. So in different parts of the world to which Paul or his companions wrote, they were collected, and others think or attribute it to the book of Acts. When Acts was written, there was so much written about Paul in that letter that they thought that this was the impetus that decided on collecting. Let's get busy and collect all these materials and places to where Paul went, such as Ephesus and Corinth and so forth, and discover some of that material as well. So it's called the Big Bang theory or the gradual collection theory.
Yeah.
But in terms of manuscripts, you have, the Muratorian canon. You have P46, which is an early papyrus. You mentioned the Chester Beatty papyrus, and all of that is used by people who try to bring the text together and to see what is the most valid and vital for New Testament scholarship.
Yeah. When we think about collecting Paul's letters, I also think about distributing Paul's letters. So the concept of copying, that these letters, it would be written once, but hey, we've got to send this out to other churches. Tell us about the issues to consider when we're talking about copying, getting them out to the churches, but also having these letters remain throughout time. So the copying would have to occur because sometimes documents would, begin to fall apart.
They did, and we don't know. We don't have evidence of this text being discrepant and needing to be replaced and so forth. But what we do know is that after Paul's letters were written, someone had to carry them to the church because he wrote a letter to so-and-so from so-and-so and not always the same place. And so someone had to carry letters, and I have a section in the book on 3:6, dispatching, receiving, and reading Paul's letters. So in various parts of the Roman Empire, Paul's letters went, and there were letter carriers for that. And then there were people who were trained to read these letters to the churches. Not everybody in that age was able to read. They weren't people that were very educated. And so there was an individual that maybe read these letters to the churches. And you have the readers playing a very important part in that.
Yeah, very nice. All right, with the few minutes that we have remaining here, as best we can, maybe we could cover some of the other works of the New Testament, not Gospels or Paul's letters. I think of the book of Acts. I also think of Hebrews. There's a lot of debate over the authorship of Hebrews. How was it that the early church dealt with some of the works which were not written directly by an apostle, or the letter may have been anonymous, like Hebrews? And what were some of their thoughts in thinking about that, and whether those works were divinely inspired?
Well, with difficulty, because Hebrews is one of those letters, and you mentioned that, of course. But some people attribute it to Paul because it made the canon, and so it had to be written by someone like Paul or Apollos or someone else maybe. But it was solid enough and had enough in it that it was felt by the early church that it belonged to the canon, and so it was included. And the issue of authorship is a separate one from that. But people felt that if it had apostolic authority, going back to Paul or having Paul's authorship or name attached to it, that it would have a better chance. Yeah.
And the book of Revelation proves to be controversial in the early church. Some of the church fathers thought it shouldn't even be included. Maybe because for some it was so perplexing, it being an entirely different genre, apocalypse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that. What was some of their thinking, and why ought we not be concerned that it should be rejected? Why should it be included?
Well, because John is attributed to the writing of it. And that's probably answers the question. The difference here between the Eastern and the Western churches emerges. Of course, the Eastern church didn't like it. The Western did. And I think the fact that this revelation came to John on Patmos explains the reason why it's included in the Johannine literature, which, together with the Gospel and the three epistles, really form about 1/4 of the New Testament. So John is a very important piece in that material.
So you have the works written down. Maybe you even have the canon confirmed. So asking sort of a question looking towards the future, in the transmission process, you sometimes get, this is a technical term, called textual variance. And, sort of asks the question, how do we know what we have today that we call the Bible is what they wrote back then? Weren't there corruptions in the text? I can think that, for example, Bart Ehrman has brought to light many of these cases, and he argues that sometimes these textual variants occurred because scribes wanted to convey more theologically orthodox views, which should ring or raise a flag for some folks that there is a modification of the text. What would you have to say about that concern?
Well, I think, Barth's a good scholar, and even though he has written profusely on the New Testament, some of his ideas are a bit unorthodox, or I shouldn't even say a bit, I should say quite unorthodox. But you're dealing with the science of textual criticism. And when you look at the Greek text, you'll see in the footnotes hundreds of variants meaning different readings, not errors, but it's an opposing reading or a different reading than you find. And when the scribes were transmitting or copying the New Testament, there were many errors that crept in. And I say errors in the sense of variance. Errors of sight, of hearing, and so forth. And I talk about this in the practice of textual criticism. And people tended, or wanted, at least some did, to conflate certain texts, so that if the text said, and the scribes were in the temple praising God, someone put in worshiping and praising God.
Yeah.
In other words, to make it sound like another part of the New Testament. So you have all these human factors that occur, and it's up to the textual critic to look at the Greek text, to look at Metzger's commentary on textual criticism, where he discusses why this may have arisen and what the proper reading may be. And it's a real science. I envy those that have studied textual criticism, solely, and have dealt with some of these issues. But it is a real science. And I think what we have to do is to deal with what we have left, to take the variants seriously, like the Johannine comment in 1 John about the blood and the water and so forth, and deal with that in the sense of what the world was like with the Greek philosophy, with Gnosticism and antinomianism and so forth.
Yeah, very nice. Good. Well, questions remain, but certainly folks should check out your book, The Making of the New Testament. Like I said, we'll put a link at our website for people to purchase it. Very helpful for those that want to go deeper and learn more about the issues that folks like Art have been studying for decades and thinking about and teaching on. It's a very good book. All right. Well, we've run out of time for today's program, Art, but thank you so much for coming on the program, enlightening us about the issues that we need to be thinking about when we think about how the New Testament was written, how it was, collected, these issues of, how a messenger might go, issues of authorship. These are all very good questions that many people have doubts about even. And I think, unfortunately, the Christian church, broadly speaking, doesn't do a good enough job of educating folks to help them with their doubts. So thank you for coming on today's program.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great.
And blessings on your work.
Great. Thank you. God bless you, Art.
Bye-bye.
Well, that does it for our program today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, and the Illinois Family Institute. I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, for all the fine work that he does week in, week out. For our associate producer, Mark, the communications associate. I think that's your title, Mark. Something like that. Yeah. He's happy with that. He's doing some great work here. We've got guests scheduled all the way through January, I think, now. So very happy that we've really been doing better at the planning aspect of our program. But last, and certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.